Minnesota sports fans, to another edition of Gophers on ISI right here on the Bring Me the Sports YouTube channel. Jonathan Harrison here, joined by our foremost Gophers experts here at Bring Me the Sports, Tony Liebert and Nolan O'Hara, both U of M graduates. Let's say that right out the bat. Boys, let's jump into this. It's a Big Ten preview because the Gophers take on Iowa this weekend in a big matchup for the Gophers' first Big Ten game of the season. Gophers coming into this one 2-1 on the season. And how do we see, after 3 weeks of play so far, Minnesota fitting into this new look Big Ten that's a bunch of other teams now added on to it this season, Tony?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's no longer the Big Ten West, and that was kind of always a step below the Big Ten East, especially with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State all in the same division. But I kind of see Minnesota still in the same mix with all those same Big Ten West teams. We saw Wisconsin drop a non-conference game to Alabama at home. We saw Iowa drop a non-conference game to Iowa State at home. The Gophers dropped a non-conference game to North Carolina at home. And I think all those teams are kind of in the same level again this year. Nebraska looks like they might be. They won their big home non-conference game against Colorado. Illinois went
You
on the
say
road and
one
beat.
like it was a close game. That was 28-10, and they just stomped all over Deion Sanders, Colorado. Let's put that into perspective. I'm no
Yeah,
Nebraska
that's
fan
very
here,
true.
but they just wrecked shop against Colorado. It was glorious to watch.
Yeah, especially the Nebraska fans, they're
Yeah.
gonna in the national media, they're gonna buy into that hype. And while it might be a little rightfully so this year because they have better quarterback play, they got a big game this week against Illinois, and I think we'll learn a lot about both of those teams in that game. I think both of them are technically ranked, but yeah, I kind of see Minnesota in that mix. That's kind of the second tier after the Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, and Michigan, and then it's kind of like 8 teams kind of in the mix in that second tier.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how the Gophers fit into this and how this all plays out. Nolan, what's been the biggest note for you? I know we talked a little bit about the Gophers yesterday. You weren't on the video, so I want to get your thoughts. What's been your biggest impression from the Gophers over the last 2 weeks, from what we saw in Week 1 against North Carolina to what we saw over the last 2 weeks against Rhode Island and Nevada? What's been your biggest takeaway from the Gophers over the last 2 weeks, and how that might translate into Big Ten play now that it's at hand?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you have back-to-back shutouts, I believe it's the first time since 1962 that they've done that.
Mm-hmm.
It has to start with the defense. Corey Heatherman, he's kind of picked up right where Joe, not last year, they had a down year, but where Joe Rossi left off. They look really good. I mean, it's back-to-back shutouts. Again, you're not playing the best competition, but you've got what's on the schedule right now, and they took care of business and they shut out both these teams. And even if you look at the opener against North Carolina, they did have a lot of missed tackles. That was kind of a problem. But they held North Carolina. What was the final of that game? 16-13, something like that. So I mean, it wasn't like North Carolina was. They had one touchdown in the game. Wasn't like they were all over the field either. So the one game that they did play with the team that's maybe more on par with them, the defense really did do a nice job. And now that they've played two, not the highest quality of opponents, but they've shut them down in both games. And then I think if you look over the last 2 weeks too, I mean, obviously you get Darius Taylor back. That changes the dynamic of the offense a lot. And again, you're playing worse competition, but the offense looks at least like it was trying to address some of the issues from that opener. So they've been able to move the ball a lot better, especially in the pass game. Darius Taylor just opens things up. I mean, he's running for 80-yard touchdowns, completely changes the dynamic of games when he can do that. But I think you're seeing that they've made efforts to address some of the issues from the opener. Now, when they play Iowa this Saturday here, we'll really get to see whether they have actually done that or whether they were just playing worse competition, right? So this will be the time to test is what are they going to do against Iowa that notoriously has really strong defenses. Will they be able to move the ball better than they did last year when nobody, I mean, what is like 100 yards combined for the two teams last year? It's probably going to be a pretty much of a dogfight kind of like that again, but they're going to at least need to be able to move the ball, put some points on the board, trust their defense. But I think that'll be a good litmus test for this team to see where it's at is against Iowa this weekend. But yeah, first and foremost, the takeaway from the first 3 weeks is this defense looks really good.
Tony, looked like you had something to say there in the middle of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think this week, kind of across the Big Ten, I think we're going to learn about a lot of the teams that I kind of mentioned in that big mix. At the top, you have Michigan and USC, who both might still want to compete for a championship. I don't know if either of them will be in that game at the end of the year, but you mentioned the Illinois Nebraska game, the Gophers game with Iowa, and because there's only been, I think, two Big Ten games this year, technically. Michigan State played Maryland week 2, and UCLA played Indiana last week.
Classic
So
Big Ten bout.
yeah, I mean, both of those. It's just weird that it's still even weird that Maryland's a Big Ten team. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just this game that the Gophers have this week. It's going to be a big test. They're going to be in the game. I'd be very surprised if it's more than a touchdown either way, and there are going to just be bounces that go one of the team's ways. We saw last year with the big punt return at the end of the game, and the Gophers were on the right side of that. And you never know if that'll happen again this year, but they need to be on the right side of plays like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into this Big Ten. And Tony, I want to get your thoughts on the expectations going into the season. How have those changed after the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season so far in college football? What's been the biggest change for you? I know Michigan came in as this powerhouse after winning the national title last year. Obviously, a ton of change in the offseason after Harbaugh went to the NFL, J.J. McCarthy and a number of the starters there left for the NFL as well. And they've struggled this season. They got stomped by Texas at home, so that's changed kind of perspectives on them. Is that the biggest difference in expectation after the first couple weeks, or has there been some other notable changes after the first couple weeks of the season?
Yeah, I mean, at the top of the conference, Ohio State looks clear and head and shoulders above everyone, and I guess that was kind of the expectation heading into the year. Oregon started out slow. They kind of didn't look the best against Idaho and Boise State, but they blew out Oregon State last week. I think they're going to continue to get better. Penn State kind of looks like the same Penn State team. They'll probably have 10 wins, but the question is if they can beat Ohio State or beat Michigan. And then, yeah, Michigan, they got blown out at home against Texas. I personally think that's a little more that Texas might be the best team in the country. Michigan, they're probably their biggest change other than the head coach at the quarterback position. And Alex Orji, who's a talented recruit, was supposed to be the starter there. And they opted to go with Davis Warren to start the year. And their offense just did not look good at all. And against USC this week, they announced Orji is going to start. So I think we're going to learn a lot if they're able to run the ball a little bit more. He's kind of the classic, like they might throw the ball like 12 times in that game. Like he's a 6'4", 250, like Cam Newton, Anthony Richardson type. They're not going to try throwing the ball much in that one. But yeah, I think we'll learn if Michigan is at the same level as like an Iowa or Minnesota, or are they with those Penn States and USC? If USC wins, they could be in the mix come November to play in that Big Ten championship game. And then, I mean, in the middle of the conference, I think it's kind of what everyone expected. I mentioned it earlier, but there's like Indiana's the one team that has kind of surprised people under their first-year head coach, Kurt Cignetti from James Madison. But yeah, I mean, there's Indiana, there's Iowa, there's Nebraska, there's Illinois, there's Minnesota, there's Wisconsin, and maybe throw Washington into that mix and Rutgers. And it's just like all of those teams could beat each other, in my opinion, and it wouldn't surprise me. And that's the separation of those teams is what we're going to learn, obviously, over the next 9 weeks. But I'd say the biggest wild cards right now is Michigan and USC, and I think we're going to learn a lot about both those teams this week.
Yeah, absolutely. That should be a fun game on the slate for this weekend. So when you look at the Big Ten schedule for the Gophers, guys, and after everything that we've talked about here over the last 10 minutes and after everything we've seen over the first couple weeks, does your expectations going into the Big Ten portion of the schedule change for the Gophers? Do you think it's now an easier slate of teams that they'll face in the conference, or is it tougher now, or is it just about the same from what you expected a couple weeks ago? Well, I'll start with you, Noel, and then Tony, you can pick up after that.
Yeah, I think it changes in some respects, but not really as a whole. You look at like the Michigan game, for example. At one point, maybe you look at that at the beginning of the year, and they're going to be like they'll lose 55-0. Now it's like I don't know if they're going to be able to beat Michigan, but maybe that game looks a little bit more winnable than it did a few months ago. I think maybe you look at the USC game and think at the beginning of the year, like, they're probably not better than USC, but now USC looks pretty good. So maybe that game's a little bit tougher than you thought it would. Same goes for like you look at like an Illinois. They're kind of always on a comparable-ish level to the Gophers, but maybe they look a little bit better than they did at the beginning of the year. So I think you look at maybe Wisconsin. You thought maybe Wisconsin would be a little bit better than they are, but now they got Tyler Van Dyke out for the year. That game looks an awful lot more winnable, even though it always looked like a fairly winnable game. I felt like Wisconsin probably more on their level, but that game looks like pretty significantly winnable. And then Penn State maybe hasn't changed at all. That looks like it's going to be a pretty difficult kind of game. And then the rest, Maryland, UCLA, those seem like winnable games. Iowa's always going to be a dogfight, just the rivalry there. So I think in some respects, there are certain aspects of it that's changed, but as far as a general, like, how are the Gophers going to get through the schedule? It's probably going to be about as many wins and losses as you'd expect if you're looking at the schedule preseason and you're picking games. If you're like, they're gonna lose to Michigan, they're gonna beat whoever. I think it's probably pretty comparable, but just some of those games maybe look a little bit different than they did a few months ago.
Tony?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's well said because like the USC and Michigan, like those teams have kind of flipped, I'd say, from like national perception, and then like a team like Illinois, like Nolan mentioned, probably is a step above, and now Wisconsin's a step below. They probably were preseason. Wisconsin's also a really interesting team if they're going to be able to stay in that mix of all those Big Ten teams in the middle without Tyler Van Dyke, or are they going to take a big step back now with their backup quarterback with Braden Locke? I think they still should be in that same classic Big Ten West level that they'll win 6 to 8 games this year. And it'll just come down to like a few calls or a field goal at the end of the game in a couple of these games. And like I think the Gophers are still in that mix. The Iowa game is going to be a big fork in the road. If they beat Iowa, it really opens the door for some momentum going into that Michigan game, and you might get some really high hopes that you're like, oh, maybe they'll be able to pull off the upset. If they fall to Iowa, those hopes go down even lower, and then you then drop 2 Big Ten games in a row to start the year, and then you come back home and host USC, and you could real quickly be looking at an 0-3 start in the Big Ten. And then those games against Illinois, against Maryland, against Rutgers, they get even tougher because you lost your confidence there. So this week against Iowa is a huge game for both teams, huge game for the Gophers. You can really correct the wrong that was the North Carolina game with a win this week. And if they lose, their season's not over. But any expectations you had preseason, it's just really hard to find those because, like I said, you're staring at that point then a 1-4 or 2-4 start to the season, and then you go at UCLA and Maryland at home, 2 games you should win, but then if you drop one of those, then it's just disaster. So I think the expectation should be the same because that was kind of my same thoughts in the beginning of the year that this North Carolina and Iowa game are going to be 2 coin flips. But now they need to show that they can win one of them because they lost their chance in week 1, but now it's their chance in week 4 here.
Yeah, looking forward to this Gophers Hawkeyes battle at Huntington Bank Stadium, 6:30 p.m. Saturday night on NBC. Should be thrilling, and I'm sure we'll have the game recap from one of you guys coming up on the YouTube channel Saturday evening, late night after a Big Ten test for these teams. So before we head out for the day, I want to get you guys to do on the fly power rankings of the Big Ten so far heading into the bigger portion of the Big Ten schedule. So let's jump right into this. You guys can alternate 1, 2, go back and forth and place your team. So Tony, you can start here. Who's the best team in the Big Ten heading into this portion of the schedule?
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that's not really debatable. I think it's Ohio State. They really haven't played anyone to start the year, but they have the best roster on paper, and they've looked like it so far to start the year.
Second team in the Big Ten, Nolan, according to the
I think it's
according to
I
our
think it's
power
kind of
rankings?
like this one too. It's kind of got to be Oregon. They've looked the part so far. I don't think you can put anybody else ahead of them right now, even
Tony,
Penn State.
third.
Yeah, some people would say Penn State. I'm going to say USC. I think USC beats Michigan on the road this week. They look good week 1 against LSU. I like their quarterback, Miller Moss. I think they're a dark horse to make it to the Big Ten championship game.
Number 14.
I think it's got to be Penn State. They did struggle a little bit with Bowling Green, but I think they've gotten the job done. They've got some good run game. I think you got to put Penn State there. I can understand. I think I had them above USC, but I think I can understand flip flopping them there too. But I think it's got to be Penn State after them.
Number 5, Tony.
I think after this week, people might give up on Michigan if they lose. But you still got to put them at number 5. They still have one of the best defenses in the country. Their offense might be at the same level of the Gophers, if not worse. But they're going to be in every game they play this year, unless it's against a team like Texas. So I'd still put them at 5.
6.
I think I'd go Illinois then at 6. I think Altmaier looks pretty good as the quarterback. They're in the AP top 25 now. They've got 3 wins, one pretty decent win against Kansas, and a couple other blowout wins. They're looking pretty good.
7, Tony.
Most people might say Nebraska here, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say Indiana.
All right.
Big. They've started out the year great. They've averaged 50 points per game in their first 3 games. Their first 2 games were against nobodies. Top of my head, I don't know who they played, but then they played UCLA. Yeah, so they opened the year FIU 31-7, and then they put up 77 against Western Illinois FCS team.
You're really
and then
knocking the team that has Pitbull sponsoring their home stadium in FIU?
Yeah, I guess. And then they blew out UCLA in what was the Bruins' first ever Big Ten game at the Rose Bowl. So I'm buying into the early Indiana hype. They have a really favorable schedule, and they could realistically start the year 6-0. So I'm putting them high on my list.
Are we going to keep up the Dylan Raiola hate here on Nolan? Are we placing
No,
Nebraska
I'm
number
putting
8?
I'm putting in the Huskers and Mini Mahomes here. They're winning. This is the one. Every year it's kind of like the Nebraska fans are like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna be good this year. We're gonna be good this year." So far, they look pretty good. I don't know if they're going to be competing for any national titles or anything like that, but they've got 3 blowout wins, one against a Colorado team that is what you make of them, I guess. They seem to get a lot of attention. I don't think they're all that good, but they've again, it's who you got on the schedule. You take care of business, and Nebraska's done that. Mini Mahomes has done that.
It's about the most diplomatic handling of Colorado I've ever heard in a podcast. Is what you make of them. I like it. All right, number 9 here, Tony.
Yeah, Nebraska's interesting because they're like Indiana. They could start the year 7-0, but at number 9. I think you'd have to go Iowa or Minnesota here, and I'm going to go Iowa because I do think Iowa's going to win this week, unfortunately, for the Gophers. But they're just a better coach team. I think on paper they're incredibly similar. And like I said, I think this game's going to be anywhere from 3 to 7 points in either way. But I would just favor the coach that has done it year in and year out.
You placing Minnesota here at number 10, Nolan?
I got one more team before Minnesota, Washington. I don't think I know that they lost to Washington State rivalry game. I think that happens. I think you can't put too much stake in one loss. The other 2 games against their non-conference have been bad teams, but blowouts. I don't know that I think you can just throw the Gophers above them yet. But but I also had Washington. Maybe I'm a little higher on Washington here because I think I had them above Iowa too. But I think the one rivalry game loss, it's just like those games just those can kind of happen. So I don't know if that's necessarily reflective of what they'll be at the end of the year.
Yeah, and because of who they played in the first 2 weeks, you really can't tell much of what
Yeah,
this
they they,
very
they
much new
can
look Washington team is.
they can beat Eastern Michigan 30-3 or whatever. So
They
we
can
know
beat
that
Weber
much.
State, I believe, and just wreck them in the first week, I believe. All right, number 11. Is this where Minnesota's coming in, Tony?
Yes, I will put Minnesota here. I think you could hear an argument for Rutgers or Wisconsin, but I just have not liked what I've seen from Wisconsin at all. Rutgers, big game this week as well. They have a non conference game at Virginia Tech. I think we'll learn a lot about them in that game. But I'll go the Gophers here. I think that they're in the mix with any of these teams. I think all the way up to Indiana and Illinois, like we mentioned. I think the Gophers can hang with those teams in Iowa this week. So I think it's a fair place at this spot.
Number 12, Nolan?
Yeah, sneaking Rutgers there. They got former Gophers quarterback Ethan Kaliakmanis. Again, they're another team that's played some nobodies so far, but blown them out. Don't really know what to make of them yet, but the results have been there in the two games against Akron and Howard, right? Akron and Howard.
Yep.
Yeah.
377 yards passing, 6 touchdowns, 1 interception, 61% completion percentage for Ethan Kaliakmanis. Is Rutgers more of the type of football that he wanted to play, or are we talking about a quarterback controversy here and that Ethan's suddenly better outside of Minnesota, Tony?
Or has he played Akron and Howard?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this week we'll learn. Like I said, we'll learn a lot about Ethan and a lot about Rutgers. Virginia Tech, one of the toughest places to play in the country.
Yeah.
Ethan did start at Penn State for a whiteout game. I was at that game, but comparable atmosphere. But I guess we'll see how that goes this week.
Who do you got at
Uh,
13?
yeah, I think you kind of have to put Wisconsin here still. On paper, they probably have a better roster than Minnesota, than Rutgers, than a lot of the teams ranked ahead of them. But their quarterback play, I think, is just not up to par. They have a bye this week, and then they'll come back at USC. So if they get blown out in that game, I think could be a long season in Madison. But they'll be in the mix in a lot of these games, so it'll be interesting.
All right, let's fire through these last 5. 14 here, Nolan. Who's at 14?
Yeah, let's get to the bottom of the barrel here. I'll say Michigan State. They've got a Big Ten win. They beat Maryland. They squeaked by Florida Atlantic. The bottom of the barrel is pretty bad the rest of the way, but Michigan State there.
15, Tony?
I'll go Northwestern here. I think Washington, if big upset alert this week. That's my hot take. On the road, I think Northwestern goes in, keeps up with them in that game, and they might be climbing up this list after that.
Hey, Northwestern knows now how to play by a lake. I think they're ready for that Washington Stadium off the sound there. 16 here, Nolan.
Ooh, 16. So we got Maryland, Purdue,
UCLA.
and UCLA. Well, it's definitely not UCLA. So it's either Maryland or Purdue here. And we're looking at the schedule, and you can't tell anything about either team. I guess you got to go Maryland. I think they lost to Michigan State, beat Virginia, beat Connecticut. I guess you got to go Maryland with it. Purdue, you got a blowout loss to Notre Dame and a blowout win over Indiana State. So
Whew.
what does that say? I have no idea. But they at least we know that Maryland can hang with Michigan State in a Big Ten game.
So I'm assuming, I think I feel safe to assume it's going to be Purdue then UCLA for these final two, right, guys? Because
yeah, definitely.
From what you guys have been saying about UCLA and what we were talking about before the show started, it feels like none of us are in on UCLA this season. They may be the worst team in the conference, so it's safe to put them at number 18, and then that would leave Purdue at number 17, rounding out our power rankings. But boys, I'm looking forward to this Big Ten season starting. Gophers turning it around over the past 2 weeks, granted, against softer competition in Rhode Island and Nevada, but 2 shutouts is 2 shutouts. You can't take that away from them. And this will be an exciting game against Iowa coming up Saturday night, 6:30 p.m. on big NBC. Looking forward to that on national television. And hopefully we get no wonky fair catch, non-fair catch calls, because let's get a controversy-free game here where we're not talking about a blown call for the following week. We're just talking about, hopefully, as a Minnesota sports fan, the Gophers keeping the pig in town.
2-touchdown win or something.
Yeah, like Joe said, he'd be
Joe take over
surprised if they don't win by
Nolan's
double
stream here?
digits.
Is that the Joe prediction here? Is it
Yeah, he
a
said
double-digit win?
He said he'd be surprised if it wasn't a 2-touchdown win.
Well, the thing is when it's Minnesota and Iowa playing, you can't even bet that either team's going to score in double digits, right? This could easily be a 9-6 game.
Yeah, that's true.
I'd be genuinely shocked if either team won by double digits.
Do we get a passing
Yeah, I don't think either
Saturday?
team scores 20 points. I think it's going to be like a 15-12 game.
Yeah.
Do
Like,
we
if
get a
you're-
passing touchdown at least on Saturday?
No, I'd be surprised if we did.
I think at best you're getting a 1-yard pounded out touchdown or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm so glad NBC took this one so we can set football back 60 years on National Broadcasting Corporation television.
That is a
Looking forward
tough primetime game because while it's like a fun, good rivalry game, it's not exactly the most exciting football you'll ever watch. It's going to be a lot of running the ball, a lot of punting, a lot of field goals,
a lot of those new Big
Minnesota-Iowa
Ten
game.
fans from the West Coast are like, what did we get ourselves into here? What is going on with this? Well, welcome to the Big Ten country. This is what we do. This is what we're made on, is football, running it, and never passing it, and just the sloppiest, most gross, disgusting football you've ever seen.
Well, Flex quote after the game last year, right, was like field goals to win games or something like that, right? That's Big Ten football.
Oh, glorious. Looking forward to it. Should be fun. Can't wait for the game recap afterwards right here on the Bring Me the Sports YouTube channel. Boys, good stuff from you today, and we'll talk to you Minnesota sports fans tomorrow right back here on the Bring Me the Sports YouTube channel. If you haven't already, click subscribe. It does really help us out, and we'll send you notifications